Rioting and bloodshed in the streets of Chicago. Police mowed down with dynamite. Strikers killed with volleys from revolvers. The slaughter following an anarchist meeting, 12 policemen dead or dying. The number of killed or injured civilians unknown but very large. The bravery of the police force. Chicago, May 4th. The villainous teachings of the anarchists bore bloody fruit in Chicago tonight, and before daylight at least a dozen stalwart men will have laid down their lives as a tribute to the doctrine of Herr Johann Most. There had been skirmishes all day between the police and various sections of the mob, which had no head and no organization. In every instance, the police won. In the afternoon, a handbill printed in German and English called upon working men to meet at Des Plaines and Randolph streets this evening. Good speakers, it was promised, will be present to denounce the latest atrocious act of the police, the shooting of our fellow workmen yesterday afternoon. In response to this invitation, 1,400 men, including those most active in the anarchist riots of the past 48 hours, gathered at the point designated. At Des Plaines Street, Randolph Street, which runs east and west, widens out and is known as the Old Haymarket. The plaza thus formed is about 2,900 feet long and 150 feet wide. It was just off the northeastern corner of this plaza and around the corner into Des Plaines Street, 100 feet north of Randolph, that the crowd gathered. A light rainstorm came up and about 800 people went away. The 600 who remained listened to speeches from the lips of August Spies, the editor of the Arbeiter Zeitung, and A.B. Parsons, an anarchist with a Negro wife. The speeches were rather mild in tone, but when Sam Fielden, another anarchist leader, mounted the wagon from which the orator spoke, the crowd pressed nearer, knowing that something different was coming. They were not disappointed. Fielden spoke for 20 minutes, growing wilder and more violent as he proceeded. Police Inspector Bonfield had heard the early part of the speech, and walking down the street to the Des Plaines Street Police Station, not 800 feet south of where Fielden stood, called out a reserve of 60 policemen and started them up the street toward the crowd. The men were formed in two lines stretching from curb to curb. The inspector hurried on ahead, and forcing his way through the crowd, reached a point close to the wagon. Fielden had just uttered an incendiary sentence when Bonfield cried, "I command you in the name of the law to desist, and you," turning to the crowd, "to disperse." Just as he began to speak, the stars on the broad breasts of the blue coats, as they came marching down the street so quietly that they had not been heard, reflected the rays of light from the neighboring street lamp. From a little group of men standing at the entrance to an alley opening on Des Plaines Street, opposite where Fielden was speaking, something rose up into the air, carrying with it a slender tail of fire, squarely in front of the advancing line of policemen. It struck and sputtered mildly for a moment. Then, as they were so close to it that the nearest man could have stepped upon the thing, it exploded with terrific effect. The men in the center of the line went down with shrieks and groans, dying together. Then, from the anarchists on every side, a deadly, unpronounceable, was poured in on the stricken lines of police, and more men fell to the ground. At the discharge of the bomb, the bystanders on the sidewalk fled for their lives, and numbers were trampled upon in the mad haste of the crowd to get away. The groans of those hit could be heard above the rattle of the revolvers as the police answered the fire of the rioters with deadly effect. In 2 minutes the ground was strewn with wounded men. Then the shots straggled, and soon after all was quiet, and the police were masters of the situation. The situation was appalling in the extreme. The ground was covered with the bodies of men writhing in agony and apparently dying. The men who were uninjured were ministering to their comrades as best they could, and as soon as possible the wounded were removed to the station house. The first death was that of Officer Joseph Deegan, who rose from the ground where he was thrown by the explosion, walked 100 feet toward the station house, and dropping down, expired. All around, within radius of a block of the field of battle, men were seen limping into drugstores and saloons or crawling on their hands, their legs being disabled. Others tottered along the street like drunken men, holding their heads, and calling for help to take them home. The open doorways and saloons in the immediate vicinity were crowded with men. Some jumped over tables and chairs, barricading themselves behind them. Others crouched behind the walls, counters, doorways, and empty barrels. For a few minutes after the shooting, nobody ventured out onto the street. A hospital was hastily improvised in the station room in the square room at the station house, and thither the wounded were carried by tender hands. The room presented a harrowing sight. Half a dozen men, from whom the blood literally flowed in streams, were stretched upon the floor. Others were laid out on tables and benches, and others not so badly wounded were placed in chairs to await, with what patience they could, the assistance of the surgeon. Mattresses and other bedding were dragged downstairs, and dozens of wine jug bands did their utmost to assuage the pain of the sufferers. Very soon the doctors were busy with needle, lancet, and probe. Priests passed from one wounded man to another, ministering brief words of consolation and hope and the sacrament of extreme unction to others. Officers and volunteer assistants went around with stimulants, or helped to bind up wounds, or held the patient down while the surgeon was at work, or carried some of the wounded to the other apartments, or in some other way did what they could be done in help in easing pain or saving life. Pools of blood formed on the floor and was tramped about until almost every foot of space was red and slippery. The groans of the dying men arose above the heavy shuffling of feet, and to add to the agony, the cries of women, relatives of officers reported to have been wounded, could be heard from an outer room, beyond which the women were not permitted to enter. Men who had only got a foot or an arm wounded, even though the blood poured from it in streams, sat still, claiming no help in the face of the greater agony. "O Christ, let me die, O merciful God," and similar expressions were continually wrung forth as the surgeon's knife or saw was at work, or when attempts were made to move those more badly wounded. The sacrament of extreme unction was administered to 8 of the wounded before they were moved from the spot where they had been first laid. As the bodies were picked up from the ground, it was found that one man, an unknown Bohemian, was dead, making with Officer Deegan 2 victims already of the crime. The following is a partial list of the 33 injured policemen. It is impossible to say at this hour, 1:15 a.m., how many will die, but it is believed that the number will be nearly, if not quite, a dozen. Joseph Deegan, West Lake Street Station, fell dead in front of the Des Street Station in the arms of Detective John McDonald. He had sufficient vitality to walk from the scene of the shooting to the spot where he had expired. Lieutenant James Stanton, West Lake Street Station, shot in both legs, not badly hurt. Jacob Hansen, West Lake Street Station, shot in both legs. Thomas Shannon, Des Street Station, shot in the foot, leg, and arms, married and has 3 children. John K. McMahon, West Chicago Avenue, shot in the thigh and calf of the right leg, married and has 3 children. John E. Doyle, Des Street, bomb wounds in leg, knee, and back, married and has 1 child. Timothy Flavin, Ransom Street Station, shot in the leg, resides at station, married. John H. King, Des Street Station, bomb wound in neck, feet, and arms. James Plunkett, Des Street Station, shot in the hand. Edward Barrett, West Chicago Avenue, shot in the knee and ankle, has wife and 6 children. J. Simons, West Chicago Avenue, shot inside, has wife and 2 children. A.C. Keller, Des Street Station, shot inside. L.J. Murphy, Des Street, shot in neck and hand, foot hurt by bomb, married. T. Butterly, West Lake Street, shot in hand, has wife and 1 child. H.T. Smith, Des Street, shot in the right ankle, single. Arthur Conley, Des Street, bullet wound in leg and right shoulder and bomb wound in right leg, married. C. Whitney, West Lake Street, wounded in the breast by bomb, married. Lieutenant Bowler, who was in charge of the second company of 24 men, said, "Every man in my company is wounded, with only 3 exceptions. I led the company up to the wagon from which the speeches were being made. Inspector Bonfield and Captain Ward were immediately in front of me. The inspector told Fielden they would have to stop, as he had orders to disperse the meeting. As he finished speaking, a bomb was thrown from the wagon and fell directly in the center of my company, where it exploded. Are you positive the bomb was thrown from that wagon? Yes, I am. I could make no mistake about it, for I saw it thrown. Officers Reed and Doyle were knocked down by it. Bonfield, Ward, and myself were the only 3 to escape. Everyone behind me was wounded, just mowed down." Several of the men listening to Fielden had their revolvers in their hands under their coats and were prepared for an attack. These drifted around to the northern end of the crowd, where the street was much darker. The windows of the brick building in the northeastern corner of Randolph and Des Street were filled with the heads and faces of men and women. One of the wounded officers says he saw the bomb coming from one of these windows. Officer Marks said he saw the bomb coming from the wagon in which the speaker stood. It is probable that both of the officers were mistaken and that the bomb came from the sidewalk. When the first shots were fired, most of the crowd scampered east and west in Randolph Street. The bullets followed the fleeing ones, and many of them dropped on the way before they got out of danger. A number of women were also seen in the crowd, and 7 scampered, screaming down Randolph Street. More were seen falling 500 and 600 feet up Randolph Street west of Des Plaines. Half were lost, and several, stopping to pick something they had dropped, were trampled on by the mad mob. In the neighboring store, everything was confusion. Men, in the haste to get away from the bullets, broke open the doors of the stores and entered, hiding in the first convenient place they could find. The proprietors struck the intruders with clubs and threatened them with pistols, but they pushed past these and entered. The fleeing among the police, when they fully realized the extent of the calamity which had befallen their comrades, rose to a frenzy, and nothing but the discipline among them and the presence of Inspector Roanfield, who was one of the very few cool men in the station, prevented their rushing out and taking summary vengeance on the crowds of loiterers on the sidewalks. When jeered the flying petrol wagons as they passed, filled with officers on the way to the scene of disaster. The cruel heartlessness of the men who exulted over the fact that more than a score of policemen had fallen victims to the deadly nihilist bomb surpasses belief, and yet it is far that crowded along the sidewalks both of Des Plaines Street from Madison Street to the station, where hundreds of communists sympathizers who exult in the fiendish work which had been perpetrated but a few moments before. The big bell in the police station tower had tolled out a riot alarm, while the telegrapher sent dispatches to other stations calling for aid. 10 minutes later, patrol wagons were dashing towards the scene of the riot from all directions, bringing stalwart policemen. The mob shouted wildly as the wagons dashed by, and several missiles were thrown, all of which missed the bluecoats on the wagons. The anarchists slunk back as a large company of policemen on foot marched down Des Plaines Street. Several times the mob advanced with wild shouts from the north, but they were kept back as far as Randolph Street. The anarchists, led by two wiry, whiskered foreigners, grew bolder and made several attempts to renew the attack, but the police stood their ground. At 11:30, the police made a grand drive at the mob, which was growing larger instead of diminishing. Blank cartridges were fired from hundreds of revolvers in 2 volleys, which set the crowd flying in all directions. The police gave chase as far as the Lyceum Theater, firing again, and the crowd covering Madison Street from curb to curb did not stop running until Halsted Street was passed. This fusillade from the officers practically dispersed the mob, and at 11:45 there were few people in the streets near the station. The celerity with which the leaders of the dynamite movement got out of the way as soon as the explosion occurred was little short of marvelous, and this fact led many to believe that they had knowledge of what was to be done, and therefore took occasion to escape the consequences they knew would follow. As soon as the superior officers could collect their wits, orders were at once issued for the arrest of the dynamite orators, and they therefore will be behind bars as soon as the detectives can get hold of them. Some said that when persons in the mob fell to the ground, their friends picked them up and carried them away. It is therefore impossible to give any estimate of the number of citizens shot. That the number is large, there can be no doubt, and that some were fatally wounded, if not killed outright, is more than probable. 15 persons were picked up by the police, and one of these 2 will, in all probability, die. The people injured are in the main men who were on their way home from a cheap theater, where the performance had come to an end early. Among them are the following: Robert Schultz, a waiter on his way home from the theater, shot in the leg. John Sackman, who was walking in Randolph Street, shot in the leg. Frank Vorsch, shot in the shoulder and sides and will die. Charles Shoemaker, tailor, shot in the back. Emil Goltz, shoemaker, shot in the shoulder. Joseph Kucher, shot in the back. John Edlin, shot in the head. Peter Lay, shot in the back. B.L. LaPlante of Earl Park, Indiana, on his way home from the theater, shot in the leg and shoulder. It should be borne in mind that the men who were present at the anarchist meeting were, with few exceptions, fellows with no visible means of support and professional agitators. They were not there to right any specific wrong, but to listen to wild harangues, such as they hear upon the lakefront and in the anarchist halls on Sunday. The meeting was of precisely the same nature as those held Sundays, differing only from the usual gatherings in that it was held in the night instead of the daytime. The street where the meeting was held was narrow, but the crowd was gathered very compactly. Everything points to a preconcerted plan on the part of spies, Parson and Fielden, to try the effect of one of their bombs. The speeches were planned to rouse the mob gradually to a point where police interference could reasonably hoped for, and then a man, screened by others at the end of a convenient dark alley down which he would run, was detailed to throw a bomb when the proper time came. This evening, 200 Bohemian sausage makers at Armour's left the establishment and marched down to Ashland Avenue, carrying red flags, beating drums, and shouting, "Down with the police." They paraded around all night, and at about 11 o'clock, reached the corner of 48th and Laughlin Streets. Officers Duran, McManus, and J.W. Murphy of the town of Lake were met, and the mob commenced to beat them. When Officer McManus drew his revolver and fired, Matthew Blank, one of the strikers, ran a few yards and then dropped dead. Chicago, May 5th, 2 a.m. Inspector Bonfield has just been seen at the Des Street station and says, concerning tonight's trouble in the old Haymarket, after Parsons concluded his speech, Sam Fielding, another notorious socialist, mounted the wagon and began to address the crowd. His words were of the most inflammatory description. He called on the men to arm themselves and assert their rights. He finally became so violent that word was sent to the station, which was only a block distant. And Inspector Bonfield, at the head of 125 men, marched to the place where the meeting was in progress. Bonfield called upon the crowd to disperse, and Fielding shouting out to them from the wagon, "To arms!" The officer once more called on them to disperse, when suddenly from behind the wagon, which was not 15 feet from the front rank of the police, bombs were thrown, in between the second and third ranks of men, with the effect as already stated. The second firing, which was heard about an hour ago, proved to be nothing of consequence. No one was hurt. On a table in the station house where the wounded policemen are, one poor fellow lies stretched on a table with terrible bullet wounds in his breast. A few feet distant, a man with tattered clothes and a mortal wound in his side lying insensible on a cot. Around the chairs, with their legs bandaged up and resting on supports of different kinds, are some 15 or 20 of the officers who were wounded by the bombs. Not a groan or complaint is heard from any of them. Another officer, who is found lying in the doorway where he had been carried, or where he had dragged himself, has just been brought in, frightfully wounded. There are some 20 of the socialists in cells in the basement. Nearly all of them are wounded, and one of them, a young fellow of about 20, is dead.